All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to From Protest to Politics, What Was the Millennial Left? A panel presented by the Platypus Affiliated Society. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left, for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. We are located on campuses around the world and run reading groups and public fora year-round. You can find us virtually at platypus1917.org/virtual. You can also find the Platypus Review, our forum in print, online at platypus1917.org. And you can check out our podcast, Shit Platypus Says, on SoundCloud or Apple Podcasts. And recently they released a new episode on Adam Curtis, I believe. So check that out if you can. Today, our panel is about the Millennial Left, and the panel prompt is basically as follows. The past decade on the left appears to have ended in an attempt to revive social democratic politics. Now, a decade ago, the 2011 Occupy movement was the first regroupment of the Millennial Left following a period of defeat and disorganization, itself born of discontent following the absorption of the anti-war movement into the 2008 Obama campaign. After Occupy, the Millennial Left eventually reconsolidated under the presidential campaign of Bernie Sanders and the labor leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. Under these auspices, leftists sought out a vision that could strongly inform the direction of the established liberal parties. With the defeat of both politicians, however, these past 10 years of effort have been placed into question. Some, such as the late Leo Panitch, laud the progress made by the Millennial Left in moving from protest to politics. Others, being less optimistic, point to the ambivalent legacy of the liquidating sectarian left. What has the past decade meant for the future horizons of leftist politics? In the coming decade, does the left find itself entering a wider or a narrower field of possibility? What obstacles remain to be overcome? And our panelists, in the order they'll be presenting, are John Judis. He's editor at Talking Points Memo, and I have his books here. He's the author of The Socialist Awakening, and the forthcoming, I believe it's set to release in May 11th, Politics of Our Time, Populism, Nationalism, and Socialism. It has a very nice sort of, I just like the publisher on this one. Then there's John Levier, who's associate professor, a professor of sociology at Westchester University and author of Searching for Marx and the Occupy Movement, which I believe he wrote based on his experience in Occupy Philadelphia. There's Ingar Solty of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and Connor Mosh of the DSA Class Unity Caucus and co-chair of the Buffalo DSA local chapter. And lastly, we have Danny Jacobs of the Platypus Affiliated Society. We're going to give each of the panelists about 10 minutes, and you can give your opening remarks in that time. I'll signal you. So what I was thinking of doing, I don't have any signs or anything like that. I'll just hold up two fingers very oppressively and just try to keep track of that. Then we'll follow that with a round of responses. And you can respond to each other, try to take about 3 minutes. And then after that, we can finally open up for Q&A. Q&A will start coming in, I think, before the responses are over, and maybe even before the opening remarks are over. Just don't address the responses until I've read them out loud, or don't address the questions until I've read them out loud. And you can also, of course, to ask a question, you can raise your hand and I'll try to call on you. I might give somewhat priority to the people who raise their hand over the people who type in questions. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to John J.
Thanks. It's an honor to be referred to as one of the founders of America, John J. So I'm going to talk about the Millennial Left, and I want to talk about the strengths and the limitations, and I'll try to do it in 10 minutes. If I go a little over, I'll keep my mouth shut later. I come myself out of the New Left of the 60s, a founder of the New American Movement, which eventually merged into the DSA. So I've been around for a while. The left that arose in the 2000s, there's two similarities with the left that I was part of. The first is the Iraq War and the Vietnam War, important provocations of a left, especially among young people. And the second is racial and sexual equality, cultural issues, again, important in both. The difference really is the biggest difference is economic. I mean, we were in the midst of great prosperity in the 60s and really didn't have to worry about jobs. And the Great Recession and now the current recession pandemic has hit the young people very hard, including college-educated people who had, I think, anticipations of having a much easier life, but are now saddled with downward mobility plus student loans. Climate change, which again wasn't an issue for us and is somewhat similar to the kind of fears we felt in the 1950s about nuclear war. I don't worry that much about climate change. I'm an old guy, but I think for young people, it's a much more immediate issue, and rightly so. So that's those I think are the big issues. As you probably know, and I have the statistics in my book, The Socialist Awakening, and a lot of polling, concentrated mainly in these big post-industrial metro centers and in college towns. Again, if you're talking about the active left, and particularly people who might identify themselves as socialist or skeptical of capitalism, 18 to 40-year-old, slightly more male than female in terms of the socialist. In terms of conviction and ideas, not Marxist. I mean, we're not talking about DSA or anything like that. I mean, if you look at the broad group of Bernie supporters or Warren supporters, similar in some ways to Christian socialists of the 19th century. The idea is cooperation, community, equality as key ideas. Scandinavia, a safety net as a model. And in that sense, and I think this is right theoretically as well, the idea that socialism, an alteration of power between labor and capital, public supervision of institutions, could happen within capitalism, the same way that capitalism itself arose within socialism. So again, I think that the ideas actually make sense as socialists. There's a broader group, however, and that comprises people, again, who are over 40, were brought up during the Cold War generation, have a much different and more negative view of socialism, but who still subscribe to what I would call shadow socialist ideas. Many of the Warren supporters fit in that group. And if you look at Biden now and the Democrats now, this segment of shadow socialists, the young people, but also people over 40, have a tremendous amount of clout, and nothing compared to what I've seen in the last 30 or 40 years. And Biden's relief and recovery thing really shows again, the strong markings of this kind of outlook, which, again, is not formally socialist, unquote, but has many of the elements of it. Now, what are the limitations? And here I'm talking particularly about millennials and active millennials, and the millennials concentrated in, again, Boston, New York, Chicago, Oberlin, Wesleyan, Bay Area, where I went to school. Cultural. The fact that the country is very divided culturally in terms of way of life, middle America, small town, mid-sized town America, industrial America that depends upon the extraction of resources versus the, again, high-tech finance, big healthcare, big education America. And on these issues, I think what you'll find is that the millennial left really reflects very narrowly its own cultural predilections of these areas. Immigration, the idea of open borders, a real indifference towards and sometimes contempt towards nationalism and patriotism. And again, in my view, you can't have an advanced welfare state unless people who don't know other people are willing to pay taxes to support them. And in order to do that, you have to have a certain criterion, which is that they're all, you're supporting Americans. You're not paying taxes to support Brazilians or whatever. Race, again, an extremely important issue, but taken to certain extremes and almost a mirror of the craziness on the right in the terms of dividing America, white and black, seeing white supremacy as a kind of overriding issue that defines history from 1619 to the present. Reparations, again, which is an issue which makes no sense to people whose ancestors came here after the Civil War. Again, we're not talking morals, we're talking politics here, and a difference in way people think. Defund the police, which might have made a lot of sense in maybe Minneapolis, but even in my suburb of Montgomery County, it just seems nutty. You know, who needs that kind of thing? You know, and finally, sexual politics. You know, I saw on AOC's platform, support LGBTQMIA+. And you even see that on other politicians' platforms, like the guy Fetterman, who's running for Senate in Pennsylvania. Now, most people don't even know what those initials stand for. And I'm not talking about Republicans. I'm talking even about the, you know, Democrats that I know in my predominantly Democratic suburb. So I think, you know, and then you can go into the stuff about the pronouns, the he, she, and they. On these kind of issues, there's a real cultural insularity that bothers me a lot, because the historic project of the left is to unite a majority of people around a transfer of power and wealth from the bottom to the top, and the use of government and governmental power, city, state, unions, in order to make sure that our institutions act in the public service. And I think that really has to be the focus. And to the extent that we divide people along cultural lines, we're not going to build that kind of left-wing majority. So I think in those kind of areas that I mentioned, immigration, race, sexuality, there has to be much more of a spirit of compromise in the millennial left. And what bothers me, again, is that I think that in certain respects, it's hurting its own cause. It's a distraction from the historic purpose of what should be a left in America.
Great, thank you, John. Now on to John L.
Okay, I wrote a whole bunch of little notes here. We'll see how far I get through these. Anytime I present at a conference, I always get cut short. So I'll try to do my best to get my points carried over. I would agree with some of the things that John just said, particularly at the end, in terms of the distraction, or this political correct distraction stuff. That's why I interpreted it and focus. And I think we need to focus more on the economic stuff as a unifying force. I completely agree with that. But outside of that, I think I'm much more radical than the position of trying to seek an enhanced welfare state. So let me give you my take on all of this. Okay. And some of this is based upon my work on Occupy Wall Street, right, and my research and you know, looking at what the people involved with that were all about. All right. So first of all, I do think the key thing is that if you look at the protest movements in the last 20 years, you know, a lot of them had the two elements: economic element and then the identity politic element, right? You saw that in Occupy Wall Street. You see that, in various kinds of protests. But what's happened is that the economic stuff gets put to the side, and you're left strictly with cultural kind of stuff. And I think this is a wrong direction. That's basically my overall argument, right? Well, my perspective. I have a couple notes here. So my perspective is a radical perspective. I think we need to overthrow capitalism. Fundamentally, I'm a Marxist, loosely defined, right? I don't want to have a socialist totalitarian state by any means. I'm more of an anarcho-communist, if you will, right, than anything else. But I do subscribe to Marx's overarching philosophical perspective, embracing materialism and dialectics. And I do subscribe to Marx's ideas about the oppressive, exploitive, and alienating nature of capitalism. Right? I do think that capitalism harms the self, social relations, and the objective world and the environment. And and that stuff I follow in Marx's footsteps, right? I don't think, of course, that Marx got a lot of things right, of course, obviously, right? That, the working class revolution is not going to happen, right? The working class doesn't even, the industrial working class doesn't even exist anymore, right? So there are many things that Marx got wrong, of course, right? But overarching, my overarching perspective is really influenced by the Frankfurt School, overladen with structural theories, right? A la Althusser and really just the generic structuralism of Europe, Levi-Strauss kind of stuff, right? Okay. Another point that I want to make is that any kind of analysis of the millennial left or any kind of analysis of where the left is now and where it's going, I think, particularly in this context of Europe and America, has to distinguish between Europe and America. We've got two very fundamental different conditions here, right? My personal concern is, my personal focus is on America, right? And if I look at America, I'm much more concerned about trying to figure out how to stop fascism from getting entrenched than I am trying to figure out how to enliven a radical left, right? At this point in history, right? Okay. But in terms of the millennial left, right, from really, I trace it back to Seattle, the World Trade Organization protests in Seattle, really the firing gun, right? And then you got the Iraqi war, and then you got Occupy Wall Street, and then and other permeations, right? But I do think it's taken a wrong turn, right? It started, right, in these earlier forms, as I noted, right, as having two themes of economic concerns, right, and identity politics concerns, right, cultural concerns, right? But it's morphed, right, in the United States into the cultural concerns, and the economic concerns have taken a back seat. I mean, so I think that's a wrong turn if you would talk about, where the left should go, right? I mean, you can see this all over the place. If you look at corporate America and how corporate America has dealt with the Black Lives Matter movement, and right, they're more than happy to adjust their changing the name of Mr. Potato Head to Potato Head, right, or doing these little things, right, these little token gestures as palliatives, right, to avoid dealing with economic issues, right. The economics has fallen by the wayside, and we need to reassert it. The left needs to reassert it. Okay? And I also think that that the protest movements in the last 20 years, I think were not leftist protest movements, right? I think they were challenges to leftist protest movements. They were looking for a new left, a new left, if you will, right? The old left, didn't work or was seen as not work. You can talk about polls where young people support socialism, but I don't think that socialism that the young people are supporting is the same socialism that was, that Bernie Sanders would support, or that in effect that the Labour Party in England would support, right? The whole Platypus Association, as far as I understand it, is trying to reconceptualize what it means to have a left and where we're going, right? And I think that the whole idea is, stepping back and philosophically thinking about a new way, right, of organizing our society along leftist lines, right? Not just tinkering with the edges, not just increasing the welfare state, right, but radically altering it in some way, right, along leftist lines, right? That doesn't get us into the trap of, the nightmares totalitarianism that that we obviously saw with Marxist revolutions in the last 150 years, right? So a restructured criticism of capitalism, I think, is needed. I think we have to engage in philosophical discussions about, where we are and what capitalism is doing to us and what we should go, right? And along those lines, I identify three major issues, right? Not the only issues, but one of them has to do with the allocation of values, right? I think that the left has to engage in a sustained analysis of the allocation of values, right? If you think about economic theory, right, economic theorists generally identify three different kinds of systems, right? The market system, the command economy, and culture-based system, right? The command economies have been disasters, right? These are the communist societies, North Korea or whatever, right? Market economies, I would argue, have been disasters. They may produce a lot, they're incredible amounts. No, don't get me wrong, capitalism is incredibly productive, right? At the same time, it's incredibly destructive, right? But the idea of using this market model, I think, is a disaster, right? Applying it to healthcare and education and just randomly applying it all over the place, it's just a nightmare. what we need to do is configure a culture kind of based kind of economy. And now what that means, we'd have to spend several hours talking about it. But I think this is the necessary thing, right? Talking about an alternative model outside of the market-based or command economies. Right? Another issue in terms of the restructured critique of capitalism is the idea of the self, right? And this idea of the self is, I think, centrally important, right? The capitalism, democracy, democratic capitalism produces and nurtures this emergence of the self, right? And it reifies it, right? And so you have this enormously vast, mental health, the industrial complex, right? And anytime you look at people looking at problems, they individualize the problem and the like, right? And I think this is one reason that these protest movements have gone from economic stuff to culture-based stuff, because they're really anchored in this idea of self, right? And the idea of the individual, right? And macroaggressions and all the stuff, right? It's all about the individual, right? And capitalism nurtures this, right? Capitalism produces a form of being, a form of thinking and a form of being that fragments the world, that treats everything as equivalent, the market equivalents, including people, right? And thinks of the world as being comprised of discrete entities. And this foundation that has produced this reification of the self, the individual, and people have latched onto that and have ignored the economy as a result, right? And I think we have to get away from that. And then the last thing is morality and values, right? And ethics, right? I think that ethics is really important. And I think ethics has not been addressed effectively in the left. And we need to do that, right? And so I'm thinking philosophically about three ethical positions, right? The deontological, the consequentialism, and the virtue ethics. And I'm trying to embrace virtue ethics, right? Typically associated with conservative thought. And I'm trying to graft virtue ethics onto a Marxism. And I think that's the way to go, right? Virtues, I think, are important. Right? Anyways, that's about all I got.
Great, thank you so much, John. Now for Ingar.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I must say that I start by saying that I'm a self-avowed class struggle social democrat, or that I was very much in support of Corbynism and Sanderism, because it really put the socialist question and what socialism in the 21st century could mean back on the agenda of mass politics, not just in the university circles of like small intellectual groups. And so like I was very, it really created a lot of hope, because if you remember, it seemed for a long time, especially in Europe, coming out of the global financial crisis, as if there were was only one alternative to the neoliberal status quo, which was right-wing authoritarian nationalism. And we call it in the foundation where I worked a triple polarization. And Sanders, given that the US is an empire, played a global role in putting that third alternative beyond neoliberalism and beyond proto-fascism or right-wing authoritarian nationalism on the agenda. So I think that is something that was important about the Sanders movement. And I think that, if we look at the millennial left, or the as you call it, or the 2010s in left-wing politics, I think what strikes us or me was that it had to deal with the fourth biggest crisis or organic crisis of capitalism in its history, the global financial crisis. And coming out of it, we did see a surge of the right, as all of the previous three big crises of capitalism, they all came along with surges of the right. But we also saw what could be called with Sidney Tarrow cycles of contentions not seen for a long time, at least in terms of street protests, anti-austerity politics, that Occupy was not only in Occupy Wall Street in New York, but Occupy Nigeria, and throughout the anti-austerity movements, especially during the Eurozone crisis. So big, massive mass protest movements, leading to the point that in Portugal, under the Screw the Troika moniker, we saw 25% of the Portuguese population in the streets. We also saw a return to state power, especially when it became visible that no matter how strong and powerful those movements were, they did not affect austerity politics. They did not change the course of the European Union, in particular, for instance, and they did not even lead to significant government crises. Podemos and Syriza, I would say, like essentially embody the realization amongst leftists, okay, you have to see state power. You can't do without the state, like all these notions that dated back to the anti-globalization movement, to Hardin Negri, John Holloway, changing the world without taking power. They don't function under the current conditions. There was a return to the party question. And I think Leo Panitch was correct in pointing out how important the party question is. Of course, the question is, what kind of party? Are we talking about Kautsky? Are we talking about Lenin? Are we talking about Luxemburg? Or are we talking about Eduard Bernstein? And of course, this leads me to my second point. Of course, like when we look at the year 2020 in hindsight, we see it as a defeat of Syriza in 2015, of course, but we see it as a defeat of Corbynism and Sanderism. And it reminds me a bit of a quote from Lenin in his left-wing radicalism as an infantile disorder, where he at one point says that social democracy and anarchism were actually two sides of the same medal, and that the so-called, what he called opportunism, that opportunism took its revenge, social democratic opportunism would take its revenge in a new form of anarchism. And the disappointment with the Sanders defeat and the Corbyn defeat, of course, it's foreseeable that in some way it leads to a return to horizontalism and neo-anarchism. But I would raise the question, I would like to ask, like how we even define defeat. First of all, I think it's important to note, or to think through this with the what if question. I mean, what if Syriza, for instance, had, like, if the European left had been much better prepared for a government takeover in the weakest link, which is or was Greece and is Greece within the European Monetary Union. I think that the German left, for instance, was not very well prepared. In essence, as Luxemburg, for instance, analyzed the Russian Revolution, she also pointed the blame for the failures of the Russian Revolution on the Western labor movement not being capable of supporting it well enough. Same thing with Corbyn. Like, I mean, what if the Grenfell Tower had burned down a week prior and not the week after the national elections? We probably would have seen Corbyn as Prime Minister of Great Britain. The same thing with Sanders. What if George Floyd had been killed 2 months earlier, and the movements that were sparked by the killing or killing of George Floyd would have been taking place during the time when Sanders was still the forerunner in the Democratic Party field. So that's one thing I think that at least I think is useful to think about, the what if question. And then, of course, the question, how do we define defeat? I mean, we're in a situation where organized labor, the working class, and is in a situation of a historic defeat. I mean, neoliberalism has shifted the power relations between capital and labor on a global scale, and we essentially live in what Klaus Dörre calls a demobilized class society. So capitalism weighs down on the working classes, but the working class is not a class in itself, in the sense that we saw a tremendous decline in unionization rates, especially in the US, strike levels, etc. Partly, I mean, in the US to a degree which is not comparable even to Western Europe for special reasons. We know that Gramsci said you can't conquer the state without having counterpower in society, because capital is organized and it will weigh down on your government from the left from the get-go. And if you can't fight capital with organized labor, you're doomed. Of course, it was, and it could lead to the question that maybe we dodged a bullet, as Leo Panitch once mentioned it after the Sanders defeat, because of course we don't know what would have happened if Sanders had become president. But I think that in essence, given the historic defensive position of the labor movement in the capitalist core countries, Sanders, Corbynism, etc., stood Gramsci on his head in a way, in the sense that they were trying to, or have been re-invoking class and class politics from above. right? Like, and not class movements building up from below and then eventually taking, when they're mature, taking over state power. And I think in that reason, in that way, they have been quite successful. Thank you. They have been quite successful because they did put socialism back on the agenda, the question what it could mean. And I'm also thinking that maybe our definitions of reformism versus revolutionary politics have to be rethought, because I don't see that we can move towards a post-capitalist society without some passage, some transition where the balances of forces between capital and labor are reshifted. And in my view, that is a socialist Green New Deal. Of course, a socialist Green New Deal could be co-opted by capitalism. It could be used to reform capitalism, to make it more hegemonic again, to make it more stable, economically and politically stable. But in essence, I think we have to have a strategic answer to the question, how do we reshift the balances of forces between capital and labor? And in that sense, I think that class, what I called in an essay on Sanders in 2015, class conflict-oriented social democracy, or what Bhaskar Sankara calls class struggle social democracy, has a real point, because many of those reforms that are mass reforms, like masses benefit from it, the $15 minimum wage, tuition-free higher education, cancellation of student debt, etc., and free Medicare for all. They're mass demands, everybody understands them, everybody knows how they will affect and improve their lives, but in essence, in neoliberalism, they go beyond capitalism, I would say, because like to realize those demands would necessitate such intensive class struggles, and they would rebuild class in a way like as a conscious social movement, that it would be possible for us to go beyond, like to use a Green New Deal to go beyond capitalism, actually, like to really pose the question of private property. And I still don't see how there's any other way of getting out of capitalism without that transition, as Rosa Luxemburg would have called it, revolutionary realpolitik, like a politic that has a day demand, but never loses sight of the end goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingar. And we're sorry for the troll in chat. Zoom can be an uncertain frontier. All right, now for Connor.
Hey, so yeah, I think there's a lot to agree on the previous points. Like as John Jay put it, the millennial left is certainly a very sectarian, and it kind of does focus on the predictions of just like its own class interest, as like tends to be a college educated middle class group. So it'll focus on things like college education, universal college, for instance, which isn't something that I think we disagree with. So in terms of like class unity, we're a Marxist caucus within DSA. And the focus that we want to push is more so that the failings of like identity politics is that they largely distract from any coherent solution base for economic interests for like the general population. Like there's still the considerable effort that if you need to do politics in the US, you have to unite the majority of Americans. And being able to, have a coalescence between all these different groups, the divisionary elements of identity politics, even though like, there's definitely very specific issues that I don't think are meant to be just like forgotten about so much as that they need to coalesce around something that has a path forward that actually addresses the majority of people if we want to do mass politics. So I see the question of whether the left today is in a broader or narrower field of possibilities very much an uncertainty. So that concern relies predominantly on whether or not the left can assemble a meaningful analysis, or whether or not it can also then focus on to what it has to do now to change the direction of it. So we need a political program with real possibilities of gaining political power, which power might be something that a lot of leftists who kind of do have a large and like horizontalist view at times might be kind of opposed to, I think, in certain instances. So we definitely saw how Sanders entering the national political arena was a huge revitalization of political attitudes that were largely forgotten from the highest levels of US politics. And this gave us, what you might describe as the millennial left as a sense of optimism and direction. But we also saw how in the cases of just Sanders and Corbyn, you can't put all your coins down on one candidate and expect to really change the entire political arena. And that attitude generates how do we, take that analysis, come back to the table and decide exactly what it is we have to do to build power in the US. So in order for the left to grow, it's only beginning to make attempts at reanalyzing its current position and what changes have to be made in order for the left to make long-term inroads. And within the DSA, there's a lot of considerations between, factional interests, between differences in opinion about like a horizontal worldview versus how to actually change politics at a local level, and then also change them so that there's even a chance of a third politics entering into the system. So I would say there's, two ageless primary obstacles, beginning with the realm of electoral, and then also the burgeoning labor movement. So not in any order of importance, but starting with electoral, there's still massive barriers to any third-party candidate. And proportional representation of the US electoral system is still completely null and void, right? So Judis DSA is kind of running a de facto strategy of running candidates on the Democratic Party line. It needs a more refined definition of a party surrogate model that utilizes outside parties while developing its own independent trajectory. So without proper controls on disciplined candidates, you kind of see the DSA kind of just throwing candidates into the Democratic Party and just hoping that things will work out. And without any kind of controls or any type of, disciplining of its candidates, we're basically just becoming a movement of, we'll move the Democratic Party left without any considerable trajectory of actually making a left. And it's like the neo-Harringtonites or like the Harringtonite movement of DSA that came out of the 80s, which basically said, and was, kind of like a anti-communist movement within the socialist movement itself, was that we could essentially get them in and move the Democratic Party left. And it wasn't, a capitalist party that isn't ever going to really change course on its own. So chiefly the role of DSA running candidates in the Democratic Party continues the path of becoming not much more than a left wing. So I think that, it has to be considered that, we have to forgo any notion that that is a strategy that would work, just moving it, to the left. There are other factions that, believe in like what is quote unquote a dirty break within the Democratic Party. So like we put enough candidates into the Democratic Party at some point, undetermined and uncertain about like how you control them in the first place, that they'll break from the Democratic Party, and then we'll have like an independent initiative. Now the problem is like, first, how do you do that so that you actually have control on political candidates in the Democratic Party that are actually disciplined and a part of the base, right? And also, what threshold are we looking for? And second, what type of electoral reforms do we need to pass in order for that to occur? So the general argument that we would need to kind of focus on is, one, would be developing a more uniform strategy across, the United States of putting our electoral resources only toward candidates willing to make considerable commitments to the DSA, such as donating much of their salaries to fund, further political efforts, and only hiring socialists into staff positions. Because what we often see is that socialists, get hired into political, they're essentially funded by the Democratic Party now, and blurring between like the kind of conflict of interest between who they hire into their office and the kind of separation between them, the DSA, and the actual Democratic Party becomes a very blurred line. So the second necessary step to that also is that we also have to figure out how to get ranked choice voting onto the ballot. So at first, the surrogate model is basically that we understand we can't run third-party candidates. In order to kind of, affect change, the idea is that we're going to put them into a surrogate party, which would be running them on the Democratic ballot line. Class Unity is also open to saying like, well, we can also run Republicans as long as they're, quite literally, beholden to the DSA rather than just whatever electorate it's actually voting for. So I think being a little bit more cunning and conniving is something that the left has largely been afraid of. It's just not something that it's kind of used to engaging in. On the other half of the equation, there's been a resurgence in the past decade around the necessity of labor as a tool. So that's something that the left is beginning to actually see as like, the attitudes are changing in the US around it. So we're currently seeing the largest and most, considerable increase in union positivity rates in the US. But like without any like, grand ideas about it, I think the US is around 10% union, just above 10% union rate in the country. While in Denmark, it's like 2/3. So we have like decades ahead of ourselves to kind of build any type of coherent union movement in the States, at least. So we've seen like, like at Bessemer Amazon, there's definitely a trending attitude of positivity toward unions as being like worker orientated. While a lot of DSA kind of often represents like, college educated middle management who in many senses are part of, capital and also like the disciplinary wing of capital as well. And also, I guess besides those two primary obstacles, there's internal factionalism within the DSA itself. And, you know, factions among the left are always inevitable. You can't really avoid them. But having some sort of like coherent strategy that kind of builds a path with a political and positive platform afterward is the initial and like ultimate goal that we have to be focused on. Furthermore, like the decentralization within the DSA itself can also, you know, be this kind of tyranny of structuralistness, which retains like a decentralized liberal worldview, which is like more or less aligned with American individualism and opposes neoliberalism really. And the nature of the DSA being kind of this Big Ten organization basically means that, you know, it has no barrier of entry. It then also has no barrier of consistency for like a Marxist politics. There's no, you know, considerable like political education that kind of makes it so that, you know, yeah, you're in the DSA, but you can basically trend in whatever direction, and there's no coherence around what trajectory it'll take. And I mean, lastly, on the issue of protest, you know, or politics in this respect, I think the protest movements of the past decade, you know, from the anti-war to Occupy to Black Lives Matter, they are often just like an element of actionism or like tailism between these actual like political organizations. Like in order for us to develop an actual political platform, most of these protests are, you know, considering the people that go to the protests, and I've, you know, been to a handful, you talk to a lot of the people, they're not interested in organizing. You talk to a lot of the people, they're mostly liberals or don't have, you know, a coherent political platform. And the idea that it's like a coherent ability to mass change, it usually just gets, you know, recodified into whatever system is like, you know, whether or not we're going to see it basically in like news or, you know, other capitalist industry. There's no coherent ability for these protest movements to affect change on their own. Like long-term organizing and strategy toward building a political platform and versus kind of like tailing social events is a considerable difficulty, I think, that the left has still, and that, you know, the millennial left is still trying to break itself out of the actionism versus, you know, structured politics. But yeah, I think I'll see the rest of my time there.
Thank you so much, Connor. And now for Danny.
Yes, thank you everybody as well for the invitation for speaking. If I was to ask a room of leftists in the 2010s what distinguishes them from the Democrats, I would likely get many responses. One leftist may say, well, I am not a Democrat. I only use their facilities or spread socialism amongst the base, over which the leadership does not have any control. Another leftist overhearing this may respond, but when the elections come around, don't you pinch your nose and vote for the Democratic candidate? Whatever work you have done ultimately gets herded into canvassing for the Democratic nominee. I, on the other hand, says this second activist, cannot be a Democrat. I don't even vote. Instead, I focus on building a base in my community outside of either party. The first leftist may respond by pointing out that the Democratic Party often recruits operatives and gains votes from these same communities that the non-voting leftist organizes in. And it would be preferable to have these same people vote for real reforms. Nonetheless, they would agree on one thing. This election is an emergency. Now, this conversation is obviously a caricature, but if it sounds familiar, it is because the satire captures something true about the last decade. There would be no proposal to work in the Republican Party. It's not like the leadership has control over their base, nor would there be any proposal to work with the protest movements around the Republicans. If you do that, you would run the risk of being accused of trying to form a red-brown alliance. No, the left of the last decade was primarily Democrats at the level of political ideology. Currently, it is the Democrats and Republicans, along with their sister capitalist parties around the world, who define what is considered left and right. This is why even activists who don't formally participate in the Democratic Party can be the most intransigent and militant Democrats. They tail after the ideas and trends of the Democratic Party and compete over the voting bloc that the Democrats usually organize. And usually this is under the guise of organize the unorganized, meaning not yet Democrats. Their opposition does not provide a new political horizon. And Leszek Kolakowski, in his essay, The Concept of the Left, argued that the left must define itself at the level of ideas. For the left is ultimately about the emancipation of the world and pushing the boundaries of freedom beyond what is actual. The right, on the other hand, for Kolakowski, has, quote, nothing but tactics. This characterization was not just about the avowed right, but also the opportunistic elements of the official communist movement of his time, who had become a new right. Today, such a formulation appears to take on an inversion. The problem, rather than the strength of the left, is its inability to even consider tactical questions that could help them achieve their stated aims. In other words, the left blocks itself at the level of ideas. For example, at the time of the 2016 election, I remember talking to a local leftist in Houston, that's where I was living at the time, about Trump's college loan repayment plan and his childcare plan. The Washington Post in October 2016 called his student plan, quote, pretty radical, just a few months before they said, quote, democracy dies in darkness. Again, liberal reforms, but something that at the time would have been associated with the left of the Democratic Party. My friend's response to this was to say that Trump was beefsteaky, a reference to socialists who entered the Nazi party, so brown on the outside, red on the inside. But I think what my friend really meant was that Trump was tobacco-y, red on the outside, brown on the inside. In other words, they were trying to say that I was falling for a trap set by Trump. He was going to trick socialists into supporting him. But rather than being a trap, Trump's campaign promises, whether or not they were fulfilled, represented a crisis in the political continuum. My friend would have accepted this proposal if it was from a Democrat, but ideologically, he accepted the Democratic Party's characterization of the Republicans, and that blocked him at even the simplest tactical level. The missed opportunity of this last decade and a half was to break with the stranglehold of the political continuum set by the Democrats and Republicans. The administrative parties of the major industrialized nations had lost their ability to politically lead society under the ideologies that they had since the 1960s and were in free fall. This was a chance for the left to give form to a political line that cut across the major parties. Instead, the left retreated from suspicion regarding the received views of leftism in the 2000s and distrust of the capitalist parties around Occupy to trying to capture the Democratic Labor Party nominations in the mid-2010s, and now have arrived at just trying to be a voting or pressure block in or around the mainstream capitalist parties. In short, the millennial left has ended the decade as Democrats, nothing but Democrats. But this was not predetermined. The beginning of the decade, 2010, looked a lot like today, 2021. There was a Democrat in office, and the most discussed protest movement, the Tea Party, was sometimes described as fascist. The 2010 year of the Platypus Review mainly focused on Marxological questions. Indeed, in an interview with Leo Panitch in Platypus Review 23 from May 2010, entitled, Is Marx Back? Panitch said that the politics of the left had been on the defensive for the preceding several decades. The impetus for the interview was the return of Marxist theory, quote, in light of the economic crisis. This was an uncomfortable time for the left. They had spent the 2000s focused on protesting the Republican Party and ended the decade by helping to elect the first Black president of the United States with a hold on Congress in the middle of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Obama's election had signaled the collapse of the anti-war movement, and within several months, it was clear he was not going to be the progressive the left had convinced itself he would be. But it was the Tea Party protests that were the first to call the sham, and this put the left on the defensive. The real purpose of reviving Marx's critique of political economy was rather to shift the onus for the crash, the financial crash, from the state onto the private sector and off the state welfare programs that the left was supporting. Consequently, the Tea Party was labeled everything from Koch brothers AstroTurf to fascism. Progressives counter-protested in favor of Obamacare. Anecdotally, I remember seeing several socialists with a sign that said, pay your damn taxes. But the Tea Party's discontents were no more right-wing than its echo in Occupy. They both protested the unfair bailouts for banks and recognized that Main Street would be footing the bill. Thus, Donald Trump was correct to recognize Occupy as not the opposite, but rather continuous with the Tea Party. The same could not be said for the left. The following year was much more eventful. The Arab Spring, the Wisconsin occupation, Occupy Wall Street. This is more what the left was waiting for. Occupy was exciting. The Arab Spring was in recent memory, and there was an expectation that something new must come out of this. I would even say that the famous resistance of Occupy to stating concrete demands, like news organizations, reflected some instinct, however negative and mild, that their greatest strength would be the degree to which they could break out of the Democratic-Republican cage. The effect of this was to prompt activists to anxiously look away from the major capitalist parties for something undetermined. So on a panel in New York, we had the questions were like, where is this going? Are the forms there in Zuccotti Park, are they prefigurative? Or was this set to be a step to a mass organization? The question had already been germinating to some degree. Jacobin's first issue was in January of 2011, and terms like revolutionary subject have been floated since the Arab Spring in the Platypus Review. It was in this period that the millennials purportedly became serious and shifted from protest to politics. This seemed to mean everything from joining a left organization to voting for a democratic socialist candidate in a capitalist party, down to merely identifying positively with the word socialism in opinion polls. Post-Occupy, Marxism was used everywhere to justify any millennial left activity under the assumption that this was advancing from the earlier millennial left moments. Thus, Lenin's left-wing communism is dug up to justify voting for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Trotsky is dug up to justify anti-5 deplatforming in 2017. Luxemburg's critique of reformism is used to justify realism of the Democratic Party. The battles between the DNC and the millennial left are likened to the founding of the SPD at the Gotha Congress. I mention all this to raise the simple question. The Marxism that was revived in the 2010s, was it brought back to be buried again? How much time do I have left? Probably not much.
You got 1 minute.
1 minute, okay. Platypus, the project I am part of, started during the anti-war protests of the 2000s and the beginning of the crisis of neoliberalism. The anti-war protesters were taught by either anarchists or Marxists and struggled to go beyond the single issue of ending the war and removing the Republicans from office. The financial crisis that ended the 2000s gave more opportunity to talk about Marxism because the issue of capitalism was raised. Thus, one could expect Marxism to return, but the important question would be for what reason? Capitalism's greatest resource is its discontents, which often serves the purpose of adapting people to a change in capitalism. Our slogan, "The left is dead, long live the left," was not meant to be contrarian, which would merely seek attention and lie about the truth, or Puritan, "We're the true leftists, we hold the true line." Rather, we wanted to make conscious the undigested legacy of Marxism that was going to return, or worse, regurgitated, and how this Marxism was going to pose a task to the millennials that neither Marx nor Lenin had ever really encountered. The history of the left, and particularly of its highest expression and self-critique in Marxism, is the history of self-inflicted defeats. Rather than changing the world, the left has organized defeats regularly under the guise of preserving gains or progress, and has passed down these obstacles from generation to generation, now finding a new addition with the millennials. In the 2000s, the means of accommodating the left to the defeats of the preceding era of capitalism were exhausted, and this created an opening. In fact, at this time, the new left, the old SDS, told the millennial left, the movement for a democratic society, not to repeat their mistakes. This gave an opportunity for good or for ill. Was this going to be a cry of protest before accommodating to capitalism, or would the millennials be able to break with the ways in which leftism has been used to adapt people to capitalism? Ultimately, the millennial left chose the former and was subject to what Chris Catrone called the triple knockout of Obama, Sanders, and Trump. I have more, but I think I can bring it up in the responses if I'm over time.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for all 5 panelists for your great presentations, your great opening remarks. We're going to move on to responses, which I'd like you to keep at about 3 minutes. This is a reminder to the audience. You can start submitting your questions into the Q&A box, and make sure to indicate which panelist your question is directed at. Otherwise, it'll be taken as a sort of general question directed at all of the panelists. You can also raise your hand to give your question. And I wanted to remind people again, since we're using Zoom, or the panelists rather, since we're using Zoom, the questions will appear during the responses, but I'll ask you not to address the questions until I read them out loud. So yeah, we'll start in the same order in which we started with the opening remarks. So John Jay. You're muted.
Your mic is off.
It is? It's okay?
Yeah, now it's okay.
Okay. Yeah, no, I didn't even know we were going to respond, so I would have kept notes of all the things I disagreed with. I was surprised how far, I usually don't deal with people who are, quote, Marxists. I mean, most of the audiences. So I never argue about things on those terms. Let me just say something about the political climate now and how different it is from the 60s and early 70s. When I was in the New American Movement, our San Francisco chapter had the idea of putting socialism on the agenda. And we ran in elections, which was, you know, if you were around then, was very controversial on the left. Most people thought that, you know, elections were just bourgeois. So, and we ran a candidate for Board of Supervisors in San Francisco. And there were, I think, 16 candidates and 4 were going to be chosen. I think it was 1973. And our candidate was, a housing organizer, you know, somewhat well-known and well-spoken. And she came in 15th behind somebody called Jesus Christ Satan, who was a perennial in San Francisco elections. I'll just give you an idea again. Now in San Francisco, one of the people on the Board of Supervisors is from DSA. The Attorney General is this guy Boudin, who's also a socialist. So they're really, again, in these certain areas of the country, there has just been an incredible change, which to somebody like me seems miraculous. And the Bernie campaign also just completely astonished me in 2015 and 2016. And I wouldn't underestimate the importance of that. First of all, you know, in terms of the discontent about capitalism, that I think is real, and I think it can be built upon. The second thing I'll say, though, again, is to, when Abigail Spanberger, the congresswoman from Richmond, and AOC got into this spat after the election where she said that the defund the police and socialism had made it very hard for congressional candidates in swing districts like her own, which included a lot of the Richmond suburbs. I think she was right. And we're still at a time where for most people, again, over 40 in the United States, brought up in the era of the Cold War, socialism is a kind of dirty word. So but my view is more optimistic, I suppose, than some of the other people here in terms of where we've gone and in terms of the discontent with neoliberalism, with the capitalism as it exists. Besides the cultural things that I mentioned, I think the other main thing that really bothers me is the weakness of the labor movement in the United States. It's very hard for me to imagine that we're going to have any real shift, that, let's say, the second tier of the Biden program, the recovery program, will represent some real shift in power in America without some kind of strong organized power from below. The right has the churches, they have the gun clubs, they have the chambers of commerce. For the Democrats and for liberals and for the left, you know, the labor movement was it, but we're now down to like what, 10% and 6% private. So again, I think this is something that really bothers me as an American, as I look upon the future and what we're going to be able to do. But again, on the other hand, it's so much different from the way it was in the 80s, 90s, and even early 2000s. I mean, we really do have an opportunity now. We have to look at this Amazon election in Alabama. I think that's really important, and it could really set it could provide a kind of benchmark or a flag that we could rally upon, and that might lead to the organization of a lot of workers who would otherwise be left out in the cold.
Great, thank you, John. And now to John L.
Yeah, I'm much more pessimistic, I think, than everybody else here, or most people here. I don't see a way to meaningfully reform American political economics to the socialist left in the foreseeable future. Right? People talk about Bernie being the big green light or whatever. You know, Bernie was elected in a state that had 450,000 people in it, right? It's like, it's tiny, right? It's the particularities of Vermont that allowed him to become elected. If you look at other liberal states like California, They have Feinstein, for God's sake, right? Feinstein, proclaims to be a liberal Democrat, but she's just, party hack, right? And so if you can't institute any kind of leftist in the state of California, right? Then I don't think there's much hope. Don't get me wrong here. I fully support Bernie. I love Bernie. I love AOC and the Squad. I love the DSA, right? But I really think that there's a need for not for an acquiescence to gradual change, but there's a need for trying to push for radical change, right? And you're not going to get through that through institutional politics. Again, I'm not saying that you should not try. I think, Connor, you talk about the DSA and the activities. I think that's really great, and I fully support it, right? And I think it should be on the local level up from the major cities, right? And you can get socialists and elected in the major. I mean, this is not new though, right? Leftists, the radical leftists or leftists have been running local politics in major cities from Philadelphia to New York to San Francisco for many years, right? The question is how to go from there, and I don't think capital is going to actually allow you to go further, right? If you got a socialist candidate on running for Senate in California, see what happens to it, right? The socialist and any kind of Democratic socialist or whatever. If Bernie ran in California, the money would squelch him, right? Even though the popular opinion would go for him. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that Bernie could have gotten elected. He just blew it strategically in his election by not courting the black vote in South Carolina, right? I guess I don't think he reached out enough, right? In terms of labor, I don't have a lot of hope in labor, American labor, to be any. I think you should try to court them, but I really don't have hope in American labor. And not only that, but labor unions in America are largely, unions in the public realm rather than the private realm. If you look at numbers, right? And so you got, teachers unions, firemen, police, and everything else, right? So this calls for a reconceptualization, if you will, theoretically, about the conflict between labor and capital, right? Because these guys aren't fighting capital per se, right? They're the firemen and the policemen and the teachers, right? And it's a different kind of structure, right? I don't think labor is really I applaud Bernie for going on to the South and the Amazon workers and the like, and I think that needed, but I don't think that's the holy grail. I think it's on the streets. I really think it's on the streets that needs, if you're going to try to affect meaningful change, it's got to be on the streets, and that leads to the idea is something like some of the stuff that Danny was suggesting, or there's a confusion about what the left is and what socialism is, right? And you can talk about generational differences. Justin, did you put our fingers, or I'm talking a lot? Do I have time?
You can finish your remarks soon if you like. Yeah, I think.
Okay. There is a generational difference in terms of attitudes towards socialism, but I think if you peel back the layers and look at young people's understanding of what socialism is, you're going to get many different opinions about what it is, right? And so I think there has to be more of a conceptualization about what we're talking about when we talk about this word socialism. Right?
Great, thank you so much. And now for Ingar.
Thank you. I can pick up there quite well. I think, of course, there's those plenty definitions of socialism that you will get, but at least you have a new generation that poses the question, that discusses what does socialism mean in the 21st century, in terms of the transnationalization of production relations, etc. Like, do we need national Facebooks, or do we need a world state to control those natural monopolies of Google, Facebook, etc.? Like, those are, I think, extremely important questions, and we have a new generation that that is open to those debates. I mean, that I think is a really an advance, or an I think that, of course, there's obviously a lot of things that one can complain, and that I will also complain about leftist politics, and especially when it comes of, has a very particular academic bent. I think that when it comes to anti-capitalism today, there's a few lessons to be learned. Number one is that it's not possible without the labor movement. I think we agree on that, and not without a revitalization of the labor movement, given how much it has been defeated by neoliberalism. Because, I mean, if we look at progressive neoliberalism, we see that without, John, you pointed it out quite well, John Levier, that we get immaterial things, right? We get, quotas for women on the executive boards of transnational corporations, or we get, language changing language, but not the material things that the ecological or feminist movement that would benefit the masses of women or would really affect climate change. So it's not without the labor movement that can essentially weigh in against capital, but it's not without a party, because we know that class formation is always political. The working class initially is not united, it's split, and it's a question of politics to create class consciousness. And also because class struggle is political. So it can't be without conquering the state, because so many of the things from, right to work legislation to housing policies, like all those elements are class struggle, and they take place at the level of the state. But that also means if you are operating within the state, or, you're taking on the state, you have political parties. In a liberal parliamentarian system, you run for elections. And not even Luxembourg or Lenin were against elections. The question is, of course, how do you deal with elections? Are you electoralist, or do you see the elections to, do you use them to create class consciousness, to rebuild the working class from above in this historic conjuncture? And I mean, I'm not the person to weigh in into the internal American debate. I'm happy that we don't have to deal with the 1912 peak of the Socialist Party question. Do you have a third party? But what about the Labour Party in the 90s and how it failed? And it's interesting. I think that you had the third party drive from people like Stanley Aronowitz and Rick Wolff right prior to the Millennial Left. And then the Sanders phenomenon came in, it's book Left Turn, and also Rick Wolff, what he was writing. And suddenly, I think it seems that to me that there is an opening, or it might be useful to have a an open question whether a third party is the best choice, or, the dirty break, the clean break, or realignment. And I'm very interested in seeing how this unfolds in the US left, because I think one reason why Sanders could play that global role was because he was trying to do it through the Democratic Party. I mean, that was why there's so many millions of people who now think about what socialism could mean in the United States. And it would not have happened if with a Stanley Aronowitz's line, for instance. But I'll leave that up to you, comrades, and I hope you figure it out well. I want to conclude with some remarks about some of the problems that you've addressed with identity politics versus material class politics. And what the party question, what kind of party caterers do we have? And I think there is a problem with the academicization of left politics, and that's beyond the United States. We have it in Europe as well. Like most of the caterers of the German Left Party, for instance, have gone to university. We don't have party education anymore, which the party education is left to the student groups, which means that, of course, if workers join the party, they're helplessly non-competitive vis-a-vis the academic comrades, right? Because they can't talk the language, they don't know the talking points, etc. And to begin with, workers who join the party also don't have the what we call Ämterorientierung, they don't orient as well towards positions within the party, so that's a big problem, because academicization means that we approach masses through ideology and not interests. I think, if you're a student, you want to know what's the definition of the state, what is globalization, is it good or is it bad? And then you approach politics in the way, are you for refugees or are you against refugees? Are you against Nazis, or are you for, the extreme right? Are you against nuclear power or for nuclear power, and all those kinds of things? And that's something that you won't get from non-academic leftists, because for many of them, that's not the issue. Right? They don't approach politics through ideology, but rather through material interests, pensions, rents, wages, etc. And so I think that is something that really, what we discuss in terms of having a working class quota amongst party caterers. I mean, we have a female quota, which is important, but I think it's for a working class based party, or one that aspires to socialism, you need a working class quota, I think, at least, in order to deal with that problem of ideological politics. But in the end, then I could finish with this, I think it's also important to note that we don't pit identity politics and material class politics against one another. We discuss it as new class politics because in many ways, many of the demands that Sanders put forward, for instance, they are anti-racist and feminist in essence. I mean, if you do something about housing, we have the Berlin rent cap, right? Like 1.8 million people are benefiting from capped rents or decreased rents. And of course, it benefits women in particular, because first of all, they're in the low wage sector much more than men are. And it also means that if their husbands are abusive, they can leave their husbands and find a new apartment because it's affordable. So like those demands for a rent cap, or like they are material in essence, but they're also feminist. The same thing could be said about the $15 minimum wage. It's anti-racist because so many of the ethnic minorities are disproportionately present in the low wage sector. So that's something I think how identity politics and class politics could be combined in a new class politics.
Thank you, Ingar. And now for Connor.
No, so I think there's a lot of good points in that. I think I definitely am not going to speak from a point of optimism about the condition now. I think that what we're seeing is a realignment in terms of what you might call the Bernie bump, where you have a lot of people into the political realm, but there's a lot of immaturity. There's not really a center about there's no political education that really comes through this. And it is, of course, like a very, middle class oriented, college educated group of individuals who then tend to focus on their own, kind of sectarian interests, and trying to reimagine exactly the Marxist politics of focusing on working class issues so that there's a message and also a political platform that actually has like a connection with a broader public, that is. Now, I think also on the front of the identitarian issues is that class and identity are inextricably linked. So the ability to kind of also figure out the kind of motion between, we're trying to work on class solutions, which will inevitably be linked to a broader swath of benefits across the board. But I think what the failure is often in the DSA is that it's a focus on what becomes like a moral argument about issues that don't recenter on exactly how you come to solve them. And so one of the things that, I definitely am not particularly optimistic about labor in a lot of respects, but I think it's one of those just genuine necessities regardless. So we're seeing right now the PRO Act, which is going through the Protect the Right to Organize, and, the repeal of, Taft-Hartley Act. Those kind of initiatives that could produce an actual labor movement are in the works. Whether or not they're going to pass or whether or not that's going to really change the landscape, we'll see. But that's something that has to be done at a local level with people who are interested in moving kind of a labor movement at those kind of city centers. And then also being able to broaden it out to the rest of the country. Because as it stands, also the DSA is basically really just focused on, urban areas. There's really no, class differentiation between, kind of the rural areas of the country. And so inherently it's going to begin there in most respects. But being able to do that, I think, and I'm not suggesting that I think this is the ideal situation. We have to have an electoral component. We have to have a labor component. And having to do those two fronts makes us very weak while trying to, balance these two issues. And, I think the change in the electoral success is that a lot of people through, you might call the Sanders bump, definitely made people a little bit more aware of the kind of considerations that, there are bread and butter issues out there, and that both parties, Republican and Democrat, do not care. They are not interested in us. They are not actually a party for our interests. And they're going to continue this kind of neoliberal agenda that is going to, like in New York, for instance. So Cuomo has an austerity budget right now. We focused on the tax the rich campaign here in Buffalo, and it was like a $15 billion deficit in the state. Cuomo offers $4 billion. We say we have one of the largest economies in the country. We have a larger economy than Denmark. We have a larger economy than Canada, just as a state. And you're telling us that we can't find the money to do these things. Well, obviously we do, and we could do much more. So we have to also be able to focus on those electoral elements, because we have to have the shifting tax burden to redress from the capitalist class to actually fund these things, and the ability to get labor to actually be an element that can change these things as well, because labor has traditionally had the power to do local initiatives in ways in which we could build a coalition of individuals, put someone in city council who then we control as an actual democratic body ourselves. But the DSA is still very immature. I don't want to make it sound like it's kind of, really off the ground necessarily. It has a lot of movement and, possibilities, I think, to get there. But there's a lot of self-reflection and analysis that comes internally that I think a lot of people in the DSA are just averse to. So like, even if we bring up conversations about like democratic centralism, there is a backlash of consideration about what that means and whether or not we're just going to become Leninists who ban factionalism or something like that. But then when you try and pit it as, why don't we have politicians who are democratically and centralized to our body, rather than we elect people who go off and do their own thing? And being able to have a political, like if you're familiar with Kasham Sawant in Seattle, which was socialist alternative, you have this candidate who's elected to the city council, but she is not a candidate that represents her own interests. She is tied to a democratic body that creates the platform, chooses who her candidates are, her staffers are, and then has an actual platform that she then implements. But it's not about an individualistic project by us throwing someone into office. And being able to, change the DSA in a lot of ways to kind of represent these issues is something that is going to be a long pattern of internal conflict. And we have to resolve those as we go forward. And going to the 2021 convention, there's a lot of these issues on the table, and whatever platform they put forward, we're skeptical of whether it's a platform that they can actually, implement. Because in 2019, they had, a universal childcare implementation. They passed this resolution, they say they'll put money to it, nothing happens. We need to have like an actual, this is our platform, this is what we will commit to, and these resources are going to go out to these areas that we can actually have a central plan of doing these things, rather than just voluntaristic horizontalist kind of orientations. I think that's kind of the trajectory that it's going to need to take on in order to build power. I hope I didn't go over on that.
Thank you, Connor. And now for Danny.
Yeah, I'm just going to read the next two paragraphs that I was going to read from my opening remarks. So, in fact, of all the parts of Marxism that the millennial left has reached for, it was the party question that remained the most elusive. I will never forget raising the question of a party to a leftist at a community center in Houston around the 2016 election, after Sanders had lost and Jill Stein saw a small surge in her campaign. They responded to me by saying, the problem is that for a third party to be viable, they have to get on the ballot and win elections. I said back that a party for socialism would run candidates, but they would also participate in the organizing of civil society. What mattered was how the party would mediate the relationship between the political and civil spheres. They're a little confused and they look back at me with furrowed brow. When you speak of a party, do you mean the Green Party or the Black Panther Party? Well, it might seem like a strange comparison. It honestly expressed the moment. They were asking me if I wanted better electoralism or better direct action or some aggregate of both. This view is really a degeneration of an older antinomy in the socialist movement, political versus social action of Bakunin and LaSalle, but adapted to the present tailless pressure politics, i.e. how to pressure the Democrats. Even consider the common phrase, the US is a two-party system, and how much is assumed here. To say that there are two parties is to say that there are two distinct ways of politically leading society. Neither the Democrats or Republicans want that kind of responsibility. It is in their interest to maintain their loyal opposition. The reason the distinction is made by the left is in order to identify with one of the parties, to justify tactical support for one of them as being the result of something objective out of their responsibility. In doing so, the left renders itself superfluous, accepting the horizon set by the Democratic and Republican parties. Consequently, third parties don't work because they remain minor Democratic and Republican parties. We can understand why this is true when we consider another phrase made popular by Gore Vidal. There is only one party in the United States, the property party, but with two right wings. This is a very limited phrase, but I want to demonstrate something. Now the horizon is different. Going back to the imaginary discussion I had at the beginning of my remarks, an opposing party that approached politics in even this limited manner would not fall to the mainstream horizon. The argument regarding the approach to the Democratic Party would seem parochial, for the horizon of the party would not be about being a better Democratic Party, but would instead raise the organization of society in total. So the reason I bring this up is that when I hear millennials talk about socialism, I really think it's the way in which they're understanding their discontents with the leadership of the Democratic Party. In other words, younger Democrats call themselves socialists, and it even leads something like Nancy Pelosi to calling herself a capitalist, as if it's like a political horizon, are you down with the free market or not? And so, this also goes to the question of bread and butter issues versus identity politics. Again, I think that this is more like a discontent with the way in which the Democratic Party has been marketing itself even, right? In other words, we can trace the current identity politics back to reforms adapted by the Democratic Party, the McGovern-Fraser Commission in the 70s, but these were given to it by the activists of those times. And so I just see this as kind of that ideology becoming exhausted. It played a part at one time in capitalism, and now really what's meant by socialism is a demand for a better Democratic Party. So I'll just stop there and we can go to questions.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Danny. So for questions, I wanted to say in advance, we're probably not going to be able to get to them all, so I'm very sorry for that. I'm going to do my best to group these questions and giving priority to people who raise their hands. So remember, you can still raise your hand. And I wanted to say to Mike in particular, I'm not sure currently about my hosting or co-hosting abilities, which I think is why I couldn't really get rid of the troll in chat. So I might have to ask you to call on people for me. So first, I guess we'll go with Aaron's question. If you could call on Aaron for me.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, everybody. Two questions, one really quick one, and then one that I think is a bit more important. So first, I was just thinking when I heard all of these remarks and the discussion that there's kind of an assumption that like there's a left that traveled through this whole process from the anti-war movement to the present, and it's still here. And it just kind of, we think about, well, what did it do right? What did it do wrong? But it struck me that actually the left looks really different than it did 15 or even 10 years ago, and even different than it looked 5 years ago. A lot of organizations, particularly in the past 5 years since the rise of the DSA and since Donald Trump's presidency, have disappeared. The International Socialist Organization, a lot of Marxist sects that you used to run into as a young leftist, you just don't see them anymore when you go to protest or when you're on campus. And so I'm wondering if you guys think that, well, what you think this means, right? The changes that the left has undergone in the past 10 to 15 years, what does it mean? And then the other question I wanted to ask was actually brought up by Danny in his response, which is the question of social and political action. It seems to me that the panelists really disagree about how social and political action are related, or even what social and political action are. It strikes me that we don't really have, I mean, Danny's point in his remarks was kind of that we don't have the type of social and political action that used to exist in, the 19th century classical Marxism, right? That we don't have anybody vying for political power. We have elections, but we don't really have somebody trying to take state power or something like that. And we don't have social action in the sense of really organizing society. Like I have friends who go to protests and then they go home and they watch gangster films or Netflix or something. And it doesn't really affect their lives. It doesn't seem like their lives are affected by the social action of the left. So what should the relationship of social and political action be? And can we learn anything from what's happened to the left in the past 10 to 15 years about this question? Thank you.
Great. Is there anyone who'd like to go ahead and take a stab at this question? If not, we can start with John Jay.
Oh boy, I wasn't one who wanted to take a stab at it. I'll just make a point about the Democratic Party. We do have a two-party system in the country, first past the post elections. The only way really that a third party can become a second party is if we have a major issue, such as we had slavery before the Civil War, that neither party, in effect, can handle, and where there's a significant number of voters who are willing to take a different path. So you have a Republican Party. The old Socialist Party had the problem initially of being a third party, gaining support with the idea that only through socialism could you get a set of economic reforms that people at the time wanted, which, you know, a later progressives New Deal they actually got, like unemployment compensation. And once it became pretty clear in 1912 that there were alternatives both within the Republican and the Democratic Party, you know, the Socialist Party was over. I think now, again, the main avenue for politics is the Democratic Party, and that the left of the Democratic Party is stronger than it's been any time since the 1960s, in my experience. So I'm again, in that respect, very optimistic. But as I said, there's severe limitations and problems associated with that.
Thank you, John Jay. You want to go, Connor?
Yeah, so I guess on that point, is the left the same? I don't think at all. I think that the left of today is a huge group of people that suddenly got, you know, projectiled into politics that they don't quite, you know, they're figuring out as they go. And the development of their political awareness is definitely, you know, ranging between the fact that there's no political education in the kind of cadres that they're in, and that there's still, you know, kind of a uncertainty about exactly what the Democratic Party plays in that, and whether or not they consider the Democratic Party really an enemy or just another outlet for them to use. I would say that, I guess in disagreement with John, is that there are ways, I think, to implement changes at the state level that could get third parties off the ground. Like, was it Alaska and Maine have, you know, both Republican states have passed STV, you know, ranked choice voting when they're like 60% Republican. I think that there are a lot of fronts in which you can get those kind of changes at the state level. The fact is that we have to focus on like a local political initiative like that from city to city, get, you know, ranked choice voting onto the state level. And then in the future, you can actually get those into a higher realm. But being able to get politicians into, and I don't think it necessarily has to be just the Democratic Party if you can control them as a Democratic body externally from the party. I think the Democratic Party is the de facto one because most, you know, eager socialists have a kind of what you might say a moral or social predilection around the issues that the Democratic Party is traditionally a part of. But if we decide we want to just completely reject huge swaths of the American public, you know, do we decide basically that all the areas that vote solid Republican we're just going to forgo? If we could just, you know, elect a Republican necessarily, which, you know, all Republicans lie. Why don't we elect a Republican that lies for us instead, essentially? That's part of, I think, the consideration. And the fact is, people can still do that. And if you have the, you know, like here in upstate New York, very red areas, so to speak, within the Republican Party. And I'm sorry that this doesn't really address a lot of like international concerns, but I think there are ways to do that. And I think that it's just a matter of the DSA is very light-footed on these issues and is treating a lot of these issues more delicately than they need to. I think also your question was, what is the nature of social action and politics, correct? That sounds right? Okay. Yeah, I think that I really do not believe in the notion that street protests are going to change anything. And if you are going to go down that route, you have to have long-term, you know, like Chris Hedges will kind of go off on in terms of like long-term sustained mass action. And I think the fact is most people at the end of the day have to worry about their jobs. They have to worry about their families. They're mostly going to be crowded back into work, and they're never going to really have much outlets for that kind of movement. Whether or not young people can do that, I don't know. I know I have to go to work. You know, I'm a young millennial, and the fact is that I've spent most of my time working if I just have to, you know, pay my rent. So the idea that we're going to be able to do that without a considerable effort of political action that goes through organizing and labor and you know, the electoral realm, I only see those things as the considerable effort that could do anything personally.
Great. Ingar, do you want to go?
Yeah, I just want to say a few things about the first question, which I think is excellent because it's also the same way that I experienced it. I mean, I was born in '79. I studied in the early 2000s, and it was exactly how you describe it, that left-wing groups were ideologically oriented sects in a way, or and were involved in very abstract debates. And like the most advanced elements that I would say of the early 2000s, late 90s left was the anti-globalization movement, because it was asking the material questions, like was returning to political economy, because so many were oriented towards, like leave everything behind, moving to anarchist communes, or they were involved and at best in horizontalist G8 summit protests or G20 summit protests. And I think that has changed quite a lot. I think there's a number of reasons for it, at least in Central Europe or Western Europe, where the neoliberal reforms, social policy and labor market reforms only took place in the mid 2000s, like that leftists shifted away from doing politics for others. Like the anti-globalization movement was for the global South, right? Like fair trade agendas and all those kinds of things. And suddenly people realized, okay, fuck, like precarization, this is us, right? Like we can't, like we are in precarious employment, like we don't, also in higher ed, of course, but we get the shitty jobs, and we're like very, very close to being eroded out of the middle class that we believe we belong to, we have a vested interest in. I think that also indicates, at least that was a hypothesis that I had, is that people turn left in countries where the middle class has already eroded. And I would include the US in that. And I would include Britain in it, because for a number of reasons, deindustrialization, the weakness of the labor unions, and the tuition fee-based funding of higher education, which essentially creates qualified workers, right? Professional workers. So I think like all those things have essentially materialized the left, which is a good thing, I believe. And also the failures of the mass street protests also showed that you need to call the question of power. And also the rise of the far right has shifted us towards asking the question of power, because in essence, I believe Poulantzas was right when he said that fascism thrives not because the left is too strong. It's not capital's choice to protect private property from the working class, but fascism thrives when the situation has become so dire that a real alternative, real felt alternative in the lives of the masses is necessary, but the left can't deliver it, when the left is too weak to deliver such a response. And I think all those things have repoliticized our leftist activism in a way that is very good. And I think with regards to the question of strategy, we should accept that we need to do a lot of mistakes. Like we will be doing a lot of mistakes. We're testing things. I mean, Syriza was a test. A lot of European leftists did not believe that the European Union was going to do what it did. And a lot of people learned from about the nature of the European Union. And I think that the left, after Corbyn and Sanders, is stronger, not weaker. And we will see new surges. And I think like we have to have a broad church with regards to how to engage in elections without electoralism and things like that. So I'm very happy to have this debate with you.
Great. John L., do you want to give it a try?
Yeah, so many things to say. If I understand that the theme of the question, it has to do with the changing orientation of the left or whatever. But before I get to that, I just want to address a couple other comments people have made. And this is about America. I don't think America exists. I think there are two Americas. I think it's fanciful to think that people in rural Alabama and people in New York City actually think about their worlds, actually experience their worlds in the same way. We're talking about fundamentally different countries, right, within one country, right? I think you're denying realities. I think if you think that there's a commonality, a fundamental commonality amongst these red and blue states, I really don't believe that there is. The other thing is, people have talked about interest, right? And when you think about interest in terms of red states and blue states, the people in red state America didn't vote for Trump because of interests, right? People in red state America are not driven by their interests, right? And I don't think the focus on interests, right, to the exclusion of notions of being and a whole bunch of other stuff, right, is on the right track if you want to invigorate a left, right? That's just my 2 cents. Right?
You want to say something, Danny?
Yes. So I would say again, this question of two parties. I was thinking back to Occupy Philadelphia in 2011, and Occupy was a response to a Democratic Party administration, and it was a rejection. They were fed up with, impatient with the change in hope. And the following year, I saw people who were arrested at Occupy vote for Barack Obama. And so why did they vote for Barack Obama? Well, it might seem a little quaint, but at the time, Mitt Romney was considered related to fascists or fascist enabling, having some kind of ties to like fascist Mormonism. And so the reason I bring that up is because, again, to say something like a two-party system, like you can talk about the structural aspect, but I think what's really at issue is that people are not indifferent amongst the parties, right? In other words, it really is like the end of the world if the Republicans are going to be elected. And that seems to happen every single election cycle. And so consequently, people look for a way in the Democratic Party, and there's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. They render themselves superfluous, and then a third party is impossible, and then the cycle continues. And so, like to me, how I try to structure my remarks in terms of the political ideology, it's not like, I'm not saying the Republican Party is good either. I'm just saying that, like, maybe we need to break out of the political continuum as it's constituted by the Democrats and Republicans. I feel like there were opportunities in the 2010s, right? In other words, the line we hear all the time right now is realignment, 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 right? And there really was a crisis in political ideology. And yet I saw the less response to when there would be like things that were unusual, like the example I gave with Trump's childcare and student care. And again, this is a capitalist reform. I'm not saying this is like socialism, as was kind of brought up earlier. But like people block themselves from even at the basic tactical level considering, right? They were like, oh, if it's a Republican, it must be a trick, right? It's a trap, basically. And so consequently, what I'm really seeing the Millennial Left doing right now is they've done some kind of marketing campaign for the Democratic Party. This is why AOC is the future of the Democrats, but also Pete Buttigieg. And that it's going to set the cycle in motion again. And, I don't know, I enjoy talking to Zoomers because I think at the moment they're somewhat more open to maybe we don't have to follow the millennials, but that's been kind of my view on what's happened in the last decade.
Great. Thank you for all the panelists for responding to that question. I'm going to do one text question and then probably go back around to someone who is raising their hand. Well, actually, rather, I'm going to do two text questions that are kind of related. They connect very closely to this issue of discontent and how the Millennial Left manages to address discontent as sort of a phenomenon of capitalism. One is from Lewis Haling. He says, as to the question, what was the Millennial Left? It seems important to discuss the class character of that group, which is predominantly the discontented urban petite bourgeois rather than the working class. How would the panelists address the disconnect and at times antagonism between the so-called professional managerial class and the largely still politically disenfranchised working class? And the next one, very related, is from Wyatt. It says, has the Millennial Left misrecognized the discontents of neoliberal capitalism, while the right, especially the Trumpian right specifically, actually has recognized them? Meanwhile, the left has been at best worsening their plight. For instance, it seems to exclude from its organizing rural and ex-urban, lesser educated Americans, incels. I'm not making a value judgment about these people, just pointing to them as unorganized discontents of capitalism the Millennial Left seems to ignore, and so forth, who are possibly negatively impacted by the agenda of the Millennial Left and openly demonized by leftists like AOC, leftists being in quotes. Has the Millennial Left just been a jobs program for young managerial class university educated kids? So this all relates to discontent and the question of the Democratic Party, the left, and the professional managerial class. Does anyone want to go?
Yeah, I'm happy to do it here.
All right, you and then Danny can go.
Okay, I was hoping this question would come up, and it sort of was, several of the people mentioned this professional managerial class thing, which I think is a really pernicious notion. If you look at the history of socialism, the socialist parties in Europe began among the aristocracy of labor, Social Democrats in Germany, Labor Party in Britain. It began at the top, not the bottom, didn't become among the unemployed, didn't become among laborers. Bernie Sanders' main labor support was nurses. Now, nurses, you could say some are private, some are public, but I wouldn't identify a nurse or a teacher with somebody who works, let's say, for a big corporation, a middle manager, or white collar sales, whose main interest is increasing the bottom line. I think you have in the United States and in Europe as well the creation of a whole group of people whose interests are not simply, again, bottom line, but in the excellence of their work. Software developers who want to create cool code, again, teachers who want to teach, nurses who want to heal, again, who have a different objective. And they have formed a very important part of the left in America. And it starts in the 60s, and you start to see it really tipping in the 1988 election with Dukakis, when in terms of census terms, the people who were professionals went Democratic for the first time. And not petty bourgeois. My wife's a retired dentist, so I guess she would be petty bourgeois because she owned her own business. But we're not talking about a small business class, but we are talking about people who work for a living, again, who are dependent upon huge institutions, some private and some public, and who've played a major role in pushing the Democratic Party to the left. So I really wouldn't get into this professional managerial stuff. I think that's really errant nonsense, and it's going to lead the left in exactly the wrong direction.
Okay, Danny?
I'm going to read the last 3 paragraphs of my paper, which I think will complement what John Jay just said. For a socialist party would relate the political and civil spheres of capitalism together as expressing the contradiction embodied in what was classically called the proletariat. Citizens, the political sphere without property, the civil sphere. But with the collapse of socialist parties in the 20th century, the ability to mediate this contradiction disintegrated, and the left found itself necessarily under the administrative parties, the Democrats and Republicans. The collapse has often been explained as a result of objective structural change, industrialization, but that only avoids the Marxist point that what made the working class the proletariat was precisely how it went beyond the factory floor. For there have always been workers and wage laborers, but the class struggle for Marx and Engels and radicals, Second, Third, and Fourth Internationals was always political struggle. This distinction was pointed out by Leo Panitch on a platypus panel in 2015, when he said that the period from the 1870s to the 1920s was the first time in history that humanity saw, quote, the permanent self-organized representative political bodies of the subordinate class. The issue going forward is how this crisis is being resolved. I think this will help with the 2 questions. The new Democrats and the new Republicans are already coming into their own with the help of the discontents raised at the beginning of the decade. In the fall of 1960, Michael Harrington outlined his strategy for political realignment of the mainstream parties as forcing the, quote, Southern racists and certain other corruptive elements out of the Democratic Party. If I replace the above with DNC centrists and perhaps even the professional managerial class, it would be hard to distinguish this from the present left activism, except for the fact that Harrington's strategy was to realign the Democrats and Republicans to then allow for the emergence of the Socialist Party. In other words, a return to the 1900 era Debs standpoint of the Republicans as the capitalist party and the Democrats as the petty bourgeois party. This strategy did not work, and the founding of DSOC over a decade later was, as he put it, quote, the defeated remnant of a defeated remnant. And yet the left continues to try to accomplish this very goal, perhaps when it is already on its way out. I think this will also go to Wyatt's question in the next paragraph. The contemporary right, who continue to make decisions purely on tactics, paradoxically end up being more open to ideas precisely because they are less attached to the prevailing political ideology. They demonstrate that all that is solid can still melt to air, but only negatively. Returning to the Kolakowski, if the left ought to define itself at the level of ideas, And if these ideas currently block the left, causing it to lag behind historical changes, then this is a problem that should point towards its solution, or ought to. For the left to be reborn, it needs to overcome itself. So that would be kind of my answer to those two questions, as well as a compliment to what John Jay said.
Great, thank you, Dan. Does anyone else want to take a go at this question? Okay, Connor and then Ingar.
Yeah, so, I think that, the PMC is not a class distinction, right? It's more like a stratum of you would consider what tends to be a petty bourgeois kind of orientation. And, I definitely think that there isn't much, necessity on kind of focusing on it. I do think that, a lot of the problem is that people within different class distinctions and class, stratums do have antagonistic relationships with the working class interests. So I do think that there, and, same thing with like the millennial left, a significant amount of them are coming from, petty bourgeois, college educated background. And so their interests are, maybe not so sacrosanct around what exactly they're, because I mean, in a lot of senses, a lot of people who end up in DSA leadership are really just funneling themselves right back into being hired by the Democratic Party. And I don't see necessarily a lot of distinguishment between them really being a class, focused kind of, solidaristic group. And I say this as someone who is college educated, works at a university, and is in leadership within a chapter. But we don't have barriers for leadership against exactly what we want to do in terms of kind of preventing those kind of class distinctions. It's like one thing we've done, in our chapter is saying, like, if you run for leadership, you have to disclose, are you a landlord? Are you, someone of the professional managerial class? And are you actually someone who is opposed or interested essentially within class interests? I think that there is a problem there, but I definitely think that it could be, over accentuated. And trying to, tie that back in, I do think that there is an element of kind of like careerism within the DSA itself, where you find even like leaders from the DSA, they'll be explicitly landlords, explicitly hired by the Democratic Party, and are very suspect to think that they're really any type of class solidarity from that, and do often focus on middle class kind of petty bourgeois issues. And that's something that we should frustrate and try and refocus on working class issues to develop a left out of that.
Thank you, Connor. All right, Ingar.
Yeah, I think the points that John Judis raised are very important, because I think there's limits to, I mean, how to organize people who have inclinations to the right. And I would say an incel does have, the anti-feminism, many of the things are open at least to right-wing positions. But the point I was trying to make is that how to define, I also am in disagreement with the term professional managerial class, because I think the question is how we define the working class today. I mean, it's clear, I think there's a problem. I praised Nikos Poulantzas earlier for his theory of fascism, but I think where he has to be, where people like him have to be criticized is their narrow conceptualization of the working class. He essentially said it's only the industrial working class that is the working class, and he defined teachers and firefighters and policemen he would define as the new petty bourgeoisie, as opposed to the old petty bourgeoisie who then maybe run is a dentist and owns their own small business. And I think, there was a reason why he did that, namely saying that especially if you have a socialized social reproduction sector, or if a national health system, most of them are financed through surplus value that is reaped from the private sector. So of course, you can't neglect the industrial sector if the nurses' wages and etc. are paid from the surplus value which is taken from there. So there's the industrial labor movement of working class has to be part of a socialist strategy. But I think there's a point to be made about the difference between, on the one hand, value creating working classes and value maintaining working classes, because like the crisis and social class struggles, they can come from both spheres, right? Like we do see intensifications now, especially in the COVID-19 crisis, contradictions and intensified struggles from the healthcare sector. And it's there's a reason why, you know, Sandra said the nurses support, and why also the left party in Germany has its strongest union core amongst nurses and healthcare sector workers. And taking up John Judis' point, I mean, I think it's important to note that we're always, like, especially from the 1848 revolutions, the most advanced, even declassed elements of the working class. Earlier, you know, there were pre-industrial petty bourgeois in essence that were proletarianized and then became leaders of the working class movement. Nonetheless, if we look at the history of the 20th century, if you only rely on the advanced working class, you risk fascism, in essence. You know, Gramsci's Southern Italian question, but also, you know, how fascism emerged based on especially the countryside and the urban-rural divide. And I think that is something that the left has to have answers for. I agree with what was said earlier, that certain parts of the element don't have the same viewpoints. Like John Levier, I think, mentioned that like they're not the same countries, and it's the same thing applies to large parts of Europe, where you have a growing geographical divide between functioning cores, urban metropolitan areas, and like the hinterland that is neglected. And I think the left has to have answers for it. I once tested like the slogan that we have to have a right to stay. We discussed that with regards to refugees, that we you know, we discuss it as a right to stay against global capitalism and globalization of capitalism, for people to stay in their home countries, to not be proletarianized in Africa as a result of Western agrarian imports. But we have to have a debate about this, I think, as a right to stay in the hinterland. And the state, you know, like we have to put pressure, or we have to develop demands, popular demands, that allow people not to have to move from, like, say, Camden, New Jersey to New York to compete with more and more professionalized workers. Yeah.
It's we're getting close to the end, so I just wanted to ask 2.5 questions.
Okay.
Can I respond to we have time or no?
Sorry, we don't have too much time. We have like
okay, go ahead.
Yeah, and I'll make sure these are also going to be the opening remarks, so everyone can get 2 minutes. So these questions are from Pam, and then I have half of one from David F, and they all are very closely linked. So, can the panelists clarify if the millennial left has made progress over the last 14 years? What is the miraculous change? What are the millennial left's highest achievements? Have they learned from each other in an international way? And what are the differences between the new left and the millennial left in that regard? And David F also points to the liquidation of such organizations as the ISO and the SWP, and asks if it's an advantage, as Panitch argued, or does it mark a sort of liquidation of political horizons? And he concludes by asking, how has the millennial left taken up, tried to move beyond, or repeated the legacy of the old and new left? And I wanted to start with John J, then go in the order, and try to keep your responses as quick as possible, but also relatively summary.
Oh, I don't know how much the millennial left has moved the country, but you know, again, if you take the enormous, the preponderance of those kind of voters in both the Sanders and the Warren camp, you would have to say that they've certainly moved the Democratic Party, and they've moved it in a way where government has to have more responsibility for making sure that big companies act in the public interest, encouraging unionization. I mean, you know, Biden's statements about unions are unprecedented if you look at the last 4 Democratic presidents. So I would say, again, in those terms, it's had a lot of influence. As far as the disappearance of those groups, I see them as religious sects myself. I'm sorry to say this. I don't see those as the constructive organizations, and they've had no success so far in making America any better or creating a socialist movement in the United States. So again, I wasn't upset to see them disappear.
All right, John L.
No, I'm still stuck on the class issue that we were just talking about. in terms of, you know, I've expressed my pessimism related to institutional politics already, so I don't think I need to say anything more about this question. I don't think there's much hope for the Democratic Party going left because of institutional, financial, cultural reasons, and including the North-South divide that I just talked about. Right? But I do want to say about a couple things about class that were raised a minute ago. Forgive me if I go off topic. All right? But you know, this idea of labor versus capital as being the nexus of the conflict, I think is misplaced. I don't think it's labor versus capital in the world today. You know, this is of course Marx's view. I think it's been displaced, and I think one of the reasons that the left is in a quagmire today in the United States and in Europe is because of the confusion about what replaced the labor as a unifying force in opposition to capital. Right? There is no unifying force in opposition to capital. It's readily and easily defined and where people can rally around. Right? We got a plethora of issues and concepts and terms and peoples, right, and groups. The other issue is to do it in terms of this managerial professional class, right? The way I look at this, you know, I look at it historically, and I see, you know, this class of nurses and doctors and healthcare workers and lawyers and professional classes in general, historically, as an assuaging valve to maintain capitalism in the 1800s and early 1900s, right? Because it deals with a different kind of value, right? The nurses and doctors deal with human value, right? They don't deal with financial value, right? And because they deal with a different kind of value than financial value, they have to organize themselves differently. Professions, right, by definition, historically, are anti-capital, anti-competition. The doctors and nurses have professions which are monopolies, right? And so, historically speaking, they were the class that was the salve, if you will, to allow capitalism to work. Now, in the last 30 years. Professions in general, the professional managerial class has been proletarianized in a lot of respects, doctors and nurses and the like, right? Because of privatization of healthcare in the United States and everything else, right? And I think there's going to be an increasing tension related to that, right? And for that class, I think has a particular kind of there's a conflict there. But in terms of them being either the vanguard or major element of any kind of leftist movement, I don't think that's where you should put your eggs. You shouldn't put your eggs in that basket, I don't think, right? So that's just my 2 cents.
Great. And now Ingar.
Yeah, sorry for taking that long with the earlier answer. I think that there is historic periods where you want to split the left, you know, where you want to demarcate the differences, and there is historic periods where you want to gather, you know, like momentum, and you want to gather, accumulate your organization in essence. And I think that the current historic moment is one of gathering, rather than splitting. There is like Marx in one of his, there was a point in time where the social conservatives used Lassalleanism essentially to infiltrate the Social Democratic Party, like under Schweitzer, Johann Baptist von Schweitzer, the successor of Lassalle. And Marx wrote to Liebknecht and Bebel, who were, you know, involved in how much ground do we have to give them, like, you know, and wrote to them, look, like, don't grapple with them in your own organization, but look at the millions of people outside of your organization who have no opinion about either of them, who are not Marxists or Lassalleanists, but who can still be convinced, and who are also eager, you know, in a situation of an upsurge of our socialist movement, try to convince them. But of course, you have to have a platform for that. And I think like that the millennial left or class struggle social democracy provides that platform because it has made socialism visible, and it has enabled us to, you know, to unfold our arguments of what socialism is, the relationship between socialism as a movement and as an economic society, as a different form of organizing the economy as opposed to capitalism. And I think that is, and that in that way, I would say that it is possible that there is an elimination of political horizons with the defeat of very ideologically driven organizations, but at the same time, it's for the for this point in time, I think it has been an advance over the past 10 years, definitely.
Okay, and now Connor and then Danny.
Yeah, so I guess on the question on the millennial left, has it made any real consistent term of change in this society? I think it has, and I think it largely has only, and well, I should say, partially due to the fact that the deteriorating conditions of the society force people to kind of think in different ways. And the kind of development that has produced is a consideration of whether or not it can continue in the future and like develop itself is something that is still on the table. I don't think that in terms of is the millennial left or is the generation of left to get anywhere a finished or a solved answer. I think that it's going to have a lot of internal contradictions. It's going to have to kind of battle within itself to develop a political program forward. And there's still a lot of ways in which it can kind of fall on the rocks. So as long as we kind of are aware of being able to like criticize ourselves in terms of like political strategy versus just like conversations over kind of meaningless debates that the left tends to have, I think that there is a path forward. Whether or not that is focused on and then reapplied is the question that we're going to have to focus on for many years to come. And I don't think that there's any optimistic strategy to say that it's going to be next year or the year after. It's a very long-term consideration. And I think a lot of people might, kind of drop off at a certain point. And I think that what we have to do is frustrate those attempts to kind of reconsolidate it into the Democratic Party and figure out how our trajectory is going to be independent of that and will not be co-opted and simply reconsolidated into the party itself. But yeah, that's the future I would hope for.
Great. And lastly, Danny.
I don't have much to say because I think my remarks kind of already said that. I just think that going forward the 2010s, there's going to be an increasing ambivalence about what happened in that decade that people are going to call into attention. I remember giving a teaching in 2017 and someone saying, well, since the anti-war movement in Iraq, the millennial left has gone like this. So if you can follow my hand, it's going up, it's becoming political, it's joining the Bernie Sanders. And I think in retrospect, maybe 10 years from now, 20 years from now, people are going to look back and go, I'm not quite sure that it was, such a linear progression. That's all I would say in that sense. Yeah, and I'm just trying to call attention to while it's still fresh, that people can maybe think about what's happening. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for all the panelists, for all your remarks, your responses, and your questions today. I'm sorry we ran out of time a little bit towards the end, but I really appreciated everything, and I guess we'll look forward to keeping in touch.
Yeah,
thank you,
I
everybody.
think it was a very good, very, very nice conference.
Yeah.
Are we waiting for the